Civil rights assassinations.
Medgar Evers. Medgar Wiley Evers was born in Decatur, Mississippi. While in Decatur, he experienced severe racism. He watched friends being lynched and white gangs patrolling streets waiting for black targets to be beaten up or run over with their cars. Medgar Evers was alarmed by the poverty he saw and decided to join the NAACP. NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Evers began organizing local chapters and coordinating boycotts of gas stations that refused to let African Americans use their restrooms. Evers brought people together and created a strong group of protesters. Medgar Evers was a huge part of the NAACP. He fought against Jim Crow laws, protested segregation in education, and started investigating the Emmett Till lynching. Evers became notorious for white supremacists after becoming involved in two high-profile cases. Mr. Evers was investigating the lynching of 14-year-old Emmett Till and the conviction of Clyde Dennard, who was a black civil rights activist framed for crimes he didn't commit. Medgar Evers was left vulnerable to attacks because of his involvement. Several attempts were made on him, and on June 12, 1963, his life was taken from him, and Mr. Evers was shot in the back while coming out of his car from work. He died an hour later at a local hospital. The assassin was part of the KKK, Byron de la Beckwith. Mr. Beckwith was taken to trial but remained innocent after all white juries twice deadlocked on his guilt, and deadlocked meant that juries could not come to an agreement. 30 years after the original trial, Merle Evers, Medgar Evers' wife, refused to let Medgar's murderer run around the streets, so she pressed the authorities to reopen the case and further investigate Byron Beckwith. After 4 years of legal maneuvering, Mr. DeLaughter and Miss Merle were successful. At the third trial, they produced a rifle scope from the murder weapon with Beckwith's fingerprints and witnesses who testified that Beckwith had bragged about committing the crime. Byron Beckwith received a life sentence and rotted to death in jail.
63. Medgar Evers, the NAACP secretary for Jackson, Mississippi, organizes boycotts of shops that enforce Jim Crow laws.
Let me say this to you. I had one merchant to call me, and he said, we don't need nigger business. So let us not trade at these stores. Let's let the merchants down on Capitol Street feel the economic pinch.
NBC News cameras carry Evers' impassioned speech nationwide. 3 weeks later, a gunman shoots him in the back. As a World War II veteran, Evers is buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His funeral airs on national television. Over 3,000 mourners come to pay their respects. His brother Charles, a fellow activist, comforts his distraught widow Merle and their two young children Daryl and Rena. Evers' murder only deepens the movement's resolve to defeat racism through non-violent means. At his memorial service held in Jackson, a 5,000-strong march is led by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
The brutal murder of Medgar Evers came as shocking and tragic news to all people of goodwill. I think this reveals that we still have a long, long way to go in this nation before we achieve the ideals of decency and the ideals of brotherhood.
It will be another 30 years before Evers' killer is finally brought to justice. Former U.S. Marine and white supremacist Byron de la Beckwith is arrested just days after Evers' funeral, smiling for the camera. He's twice tried by an all-white jury. Both trials end in a hung jury. It's not until 1994 that he's eventually found guilty.
Malcolm X was an African-American religious leader and a civil rights activist who spoke about the need for black empowerment and advocated for the adoption of Islam within the black community as a spokesman for the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X was a controversial public figure among black and white Americans. He was seen as a hero because of his stance amongst violence against the African American community. February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated. While on stage at the Audible Ballroom, Malcolm X was gunned down. 3 members of the Nation of Islam, Mujahid Hakim, Muhammad Aziz, and Thomas Hagen, were soon charged with first-degree murder. The 3 men were given 20 years in prison. The reason behind his murder is Malcolm X had left the political and religious group in 1964, following a deeply strained relationship with the leader, Elijah Muhammad, over political ideology. Malcolm believed the Nation of Islam should join the civil rights protest, and Malcolm also stressed that Elijah Muhammad had multiple children with multiple women. After breaking the Nation of Islam, he converted to Sunni Islam. He formed an organization of African American unity, blaming racism, rather than the white race, for injustices and adopting a more moderate stance on civil rights. After leaving the Nation of Islam, Malcolm received several death threats and attempts because he was seen as a traitor.
Malcolm X was an American revolutionary.
An electrifying spokesman for the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X fought to attain civil rights through militant self-defense.
This will be an organization that will give the black man in this country the right to defend himself by any means necessary.
Born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska, Malcolm grew up in East Lansing, Michigan, where he suffered the death of his father in 1931. Several years later, Malcolm's mother was placed in a mental institution, and he lived in foster homes until he dropped out of school at 15.
Malcolm X was a brilliant young man, but he told the teacher he wanted to be a lawyer, and that teacher suggested instead that he be a carpenter. That begins Malcolm X's sort of slow slide out of school.
After moving to Boston, Malcolm fell into a life of drugs and crime, and at 20 years old, he was sentenced to 10 years in jail for larceny. While imprisoned, Malcolm joined the Nation of Islam, and upon his release in 1952, he changed his name to Malcolm X.
Most people who are descendant from formerly enslaved Africans carry the last name of their former masters or those families, and Malcolm X basically let go of that name, and he chose X to symbolize his unknown African name.
From 1952 to 1960, Malcolm X expanded the Nation of Islam from roughly 400 to 40,000 members. But as an opposing voice to integration, Malcolm X incited fear and controversy.
Malcolm X was the counterpoint to Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement. They were talking about nonviolence and peace and love and cooperation. Malcolm never participated in violence, but he was definitely about, we have to fight back. He spoke for so many African Americans who were literally terrified of saying the things that he was saying.
Anyone who stands in the way of your and my freedom, our human dignity, is a cold-blooded, blue-eyed enemy.
What Malcolm X did that drew so many people to him was he had an energy that was urgent and young. And I think he triggered a certain kind of action in people, a certain kind of self-esteem that I'm worthy of challenging the status quo.
In 1963, tensions erupted between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam due to his growing popularity and his objection to the extramarital affairs of Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam leader. By 1964, Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam and converted to Sunni Muslim.
Malcolm X had this life-changing event when he went to Mecca. He went outside of America and connected to the global image of Islam. He came back differently and felt that everyone was his brother.
On February 21st, 1965, while preparing for a speech in a Manhattan ballroom, Malcolm X was rushed by 3 gunmen from the Nation of Islam and was killed by 21 shots to his body.
Dr. King was a Baptist minister and social activist who led the civil rights movement from the mid-1950s until his death in 1968. His leadership was vital to the movement's success in ending the legal segregation of African Americans in the South and other areas in the U.S. Martin Luther King rose to national fame as head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which encouraged nonviolent tactics such as massive march on Washington to achieve civil rights, and eventually he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. On April 3, 1968, Dr. King delivered his final speech, called "I've Been to the Mountaintop."
all we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Dr. King was opposed to the war. He framed the war as a moral issue. This provoked criticism from Congress, the press, and his civil rights colleagues. They believed that if Dr. King was expanding his civil rights beliefs to include foreign affairs, it would be harm to the black freedom struggle in America. In 1964, Dr. King received a letter. The letter was sent from the FBI by J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover made no secret that he liked seeing Dr. King discredited. J. Edgar Hoover worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Hoover served 8 presidents as FBI director to the beginning of 1935. As a young Justice Department official, Hoover played a role in investigating the Red Scare during the early years during the Woodrow Wilson's administration. Dr. King was in Memphis on April 4, 1968, because there was a strike for the black sanitation workers. He was there to talk about the Poor People's Campaign. Almost 2 months before the strike, 1,300 black sanitation workers started a strike because of their low pay and talked about how they got treated. After the strike, he had left for dinner when a bullet shot him in the jaw and injured his spinal cord. He was taken to the Memphis hospital, and once he arrived, he was pronounced dead. Dr. King died at age 93. James Earl Ray was suspected of killing Dr. King and was finally arrested on June 8th. In 1969, he pleaded guilty to avoiding the electric chair, and in the end, he finished with 99 years in prison. There are several differences between MLK and Malcolm X, but a major one is that Dr. King was a very good statesman who gave moving and inspiring speeches about peace, freedom, and democracy. However, Malcolm X was known for being an eradicator of those who were not of the superior white race. Their childhoods are very different. MLK came from a well-known family in Atlanta, while Malcolm X was a quote-unquote nobody. Martin Luther King focused on wanting equality and the goodness of men, but Malcolm X was focused on more so revenge. Malcolm X had a tinted view on the world. He had a lot of anger and bitterness, rightfully so, but MLK had more of a positive, sunnier side of things.